Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just going to share my screen so we can get started. All right, my talk today is based on my recently published book, Reproductive Realities in Modern China. And my book looks at the lived experiences with birth control and abortion in mainland China, both before and during the era of the one-child policy. As you know, this is a very sensitive topic, and I'm going to begin this talk with a rather jarring case from the archive. Despite its graphic nature, I chose to open with this case because I think it illustrates well many of the themes of this talk. And it also highlights something that often gets lost in demographic analyses of China and what my book seeks to emphasize, which is the fact that the history of population policy is ultimately the history of real people. It's the history of real women with real stories, and some of their stories are really difficult to hear. So in 1948, Li Huaming, a 19-year-old unmarried woman from Beijing working at the third branch clothing factory in Tianjin, discovered that she was 6 months pregnant. Knowing that if the pregnancy was discovered, she would likely lose her job, and that premarital and extramarital sex were both criminal offenses, she sought help from a doctor. Since abortion was also illegal, the doctor refused to help her terminate the pregnancy. So instead, Li reached out to a colleague, Guo Bao, a 39-year-old married woman working at the same factory. Guo agreed to help Li induce an abortion through massage, but during the procedure, Guo noticed that Li was vomiting white foam and called the factory doctor for help. He gave Li an injection and administered an oral medication, but she died soon afterwards. Later, when investigators found Li, her vagina was dilated and bleeding. The umbilical cord still connected her belly with that of a lifeless male fetus. Moreover, Li's lower abdomen was red and swollen and had the marks of repeated hand rubbing. Guo was subsequently charged with performing abortion that led to death. So, where do we go from there? Were situations like this common in urban China in the early 20th century, or was this simply an anomaly? But more broadly, where does this account fit into the longer history of birth control and abortion in modern China? So most studies of reproduction in modern China focus on the one-child policy, which I'm assuming many of you have heard of. It was enacted in 1979 and limited Chinese couples to one child each. This scholarship tends to emphasize high-level policies, and it also gives short shrift to the decades preceding the policy's implementation. As mentioned, my book instead takes grassroots contraception and abortion practices from the early 20th century to the present as its focus. So I ask specifically, how did undergoing an abortion shift from being a taboo criminal offense, like in the case of Li, in the early and mid 20th century, to a state mandated behavior under the one child policy? And how did policy changes influence individual experiences with contraception and abortion? So this project, which is my dissertation project, draws on extensive archival research at least 10 archives across mainland China. I also draw on the oral histories of 80 women and men that I conducted in 3 cities in China. But I'm not sure how many of you are sinologists out there, but here we have a map of China. I always tell my students it looks like a chicken, and Beijing is at the heart of the chicken. My 3 research sites were Shanghai, Tianjin, and Luoyang, because they have different demographic compositions, different histories, and different levels of wealth. My research ultimately exposes the messy realities of local fertility policy implementation, and it shows that the road to the one-child policy was hardly straightforward. Focusing on local politics and individual circumstances rather than a kind of the national picture demonstrates how government officials and other individuals challenged and reworked and co-opted state policies to suit their own interests. Situating the one-child policy within the macro history of reproduction in modern China also reveals that state control over personal life was not all-encompassing the way we kind of imagine it to be. And the one-child policy did not mark as significant of a historical rupture as previously imagined. Instead, the state repeatedly struggled to maintain control over reproduction, and it continues to actually have that problem today. In reality, inconsistent local policies and a weak medical infrastructure meant that throughout the entirety of the 20th century, contraceptive and abortive practices differed radically according to demographic factors like location or class or education level. And acting first and foremost out of necessity, women bore the primary burden of family planning. They thus drew on a diverse array of indigenous and imported contraceptive and abortive methods. At the same time, as we've probably seen in other places, policies and technologies ostensibly designed to liberate women from the burdens of motherhood often inadvertently re-inscribed existing gender hierarchies. So often, state economic and political goals and men's interests were put ahead of women's needs. So examining the evolution of birth control and abortion enables me to situate native Chinese practices within globally circulating discourses and debates, and to historicize constructions of normative sexuality, the relationship between traditional and Western style reproductive medicine, popular attitudes toward family life and childbearing, and the enduring salience of eugenic discourses. Of course, this is a 40-minute talk, so I won't be addressing all of those things today, but if you have questions about them, I'm happy to address them individually during the Q&A. So my presentation today offers a broad overview of China's changing fertility policies and discourses, and it highlights the fact that official attitudes toward fertility have fluctuated greatly over the last 100 years, and yet at the local level, change has been less drastic. More specifically, though, this talk traces one of the historical continuities my book identifies and addresses the question of how abortion became a relatively common substitute for prophylactics in China. So I argue that the continued reliance on abortion as birth control was less by design than by accident. Heavy-handed and contradictory state policies, as well as men's resistance to male contraception and inadequate sex education, have normalized abortion as contraception, particularly among unmarried women. So for a little bit of historical background, for those of you who don't study Chinese history all day, every day, in the mid-19th century, the Qing dynasty faced mounting internal and external threats to its rule. Dissatisfied with the state of trade relations, the British launched the Opium Wars, which eventually led to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, which was the last dynasty of China, and the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912. In the early 1920s, globally circulating discourses linking individual health to national strength gained currency among Chinese intellectuals, as they were everywhere else. And the term eugenics, which refers to a set of beliefs concerned with improving the human gene pool, was introduced to China via Japan. So the vocabulary that developed around birth control in China reflects Japanese historical, conceptual, and linguistic influences. The visit of American birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger, who probably many of you have heard of, she visited Asia, specifically China, in 1922. This led to a flurry of publications on race science and sexology and women's rights. This is a very global moment, so these writings specifically drew on scholarship from other parts of the world, namely Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, the US, and Britain. Sanger's visit also fueled an elite preoccupation with using contraceptives to improve the quality of the population by limiting births among the poor and unfit. While sterilization and abortion were technically prohibited under the nationalist government, contraception was actually neither explicitly endorsed nor banned at the national level. leaving it up to local authorities to police contraception as they saw fit. Though many were neither safe nor effective, in reality, a wide range of contraceptives and abortive medicines were available to women in urban China during this period. I'll give you a quick sampling of some of my favorite advertisements from this period. This is my, I think, all-time favorite. This is Spieten, and this is actually a German uh, like contraceptive suppository. But what I love about it is this ensnared stork image. Then we have Lady's Friend, which is actually an indigenous Chinese suppository similar to Spieten. I just wrote an article about this recently. It's meant to look foreign, but it is in fact designed and manufactured in China in this period. And then we have an ad from the 40s for good old-fashioned British Durex condoms. But in fact, abortion via abortifacients or surgery appears to have been the most common form of fertility regulation. Tiao Jingyao patented drugs and homemade herbal decoctions that blurred the line between abortifacients and emmenagogues that designed to induce regular menstruation were particularly common and by their nature difficult to police. Primary reasons for using contraceptives or undergoing abortion were poverty, not wanting an affair to be discovered because that would have been illegal, fearing the loss of a job due to pregnancy, or concerns about the detrimental social implications of premarital sex. Although it appears that urban women from all walks of life were undergoing abortions or using abortifacients during this period, the majority of abortion seekers caught by the police that were recorded in archival materials were working class individuals. It seems that wealthier women were generally sheltered from these kind of legal repercussions. Moving forward, immediately after the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in 1949, the Communist Party severely limited access to birth control, abortion, and sterilization because it saw a large population as being essential to building a large workforce and therefore a large economy. This fertility model came from China's closest ally at the time, the Soviet Union, which incentivized large families and prohibited abortion. So following this Soviet model, women were encouraged to have as many children as possible, with rewards for mothers who had the most children. For some images from this period, over here, we can see this image from Russia, and this would have been, we have to take this in the context of World War II, so the sort of imagery is suggesting that the mother is a hero in the fact that she can bear endless children, and even though all these young men are dying in the armed forces in the context of the war, she's just producing more and more babies. Well, the other image obviously is from 10 years later, so not within the context of World War II, but to my mind anyway, there are some kind of similarities. So at this particular moment in 1954, the messaging was that families should have as many kids as possible. Mom should stay home. The kids will go to school where they'll learn to, how to strengthen and support the nation. And dad is going to, wave and go off to work. So very shortly after this poster would have been published, census results revealing that grain production could not keep pace with population growth, as well as the desire to get women like this to work outside of the home, led to a gradual loosening of restrictions on contraceptives, abortions, and sterilizations, and the first national campaign to promote family planning. As a person who collects family planning campaign paraphernalia, this is one of my great joys. Here are some sexual hygiene guides from the first family planning campaign. These are from my personal collection, but you can see this is what the fronts of the books often look like, and they often contain similar content, information about puberty and sexual functions and images and things like that. This is from the same period. This very generically titled book is basically showing a woman, presumably, how to make a a contraceptive suppository using a cotton ball and either dunking it in hot soapy water or salt water or vinegar water, and then inserting that into the vagina before intercourse to minimize the chance of conception. This is a rhythm method reference calendar. If you're not familiar with the rhythm method, this is a method of family planning that's used worldwide and has been used for a very long time. Basically, a couple plans their intercourse based on a woman's menstrual cycle. But what kind of makes me laugh is this was published in 1956 for use in 1959. So you have to wonder, were people supposed to just wait until 1959 to start planning their births? I don't know. That's always my question. And finally, we have a contraceptive hanging chart. This is something you would have seen in the 1950s, maybe hanging in a commune health clinic, or hanging in the doctor's office, or even hanging in like a factory. And what's being depicted here is what to do with condoms after you use them. You wash them out with soap and water, and then either fill them with water again or fill them with air to check for punctures. Of course, if the condom starts dripping, you can't use it again. But if it doesn't seem to be leaking, you can use it over and over until it is leaking. So, and all of these ideas none of these are particularly unique to China. These are globally endorsed ways of practicing family planning. So as contraceptives became more widely available, women cadres and workers, as well as urban residents, gained preferential access to birth planning, or to family planning rather. Meanwhile, women in poorer areas, those living in rural areas, and individuals with lower education levels were often simply left to fend for themselves. At this time, poor quality contraceptives, high prices, and conflicting policies also limited family planning options. Moreover, access to birth control and information about it was largely confined to married people. So if you weren't married, you would probably not know about any of this stuff. In the PRC, as in other parts of the world, birth control is linked to women's biological roles as wives and mothers, and therefore it's viewed as primarily a female responsibility. As such, family planning propaganda, or birth planning propaganda, 计划生育 as it's called in the PRC, largely targeted and targets women and women's bodies. Due to a combination of gendered state policies and male resistance, male sterilization and condoms never played as significant of a role in family planning as women-centered birth control methods. For example, initially there were no provisions for male sterilization in China in the PRC, even though vasectomies would have been equally effective in preventing further births and were less invasive than tubectomies or tubal ligations. When I asked several interviewees in their 60s, 70s, and 80s why women were encouraged to have sterilizations rather than men, they argued that men work more efficiently than women and that their work was often more important and considered more valuable. So it made sense for their wives to undergo surgery instead. So as with childbearing, sterilization in China would become another form of gendered labor. Another factor that made family planning a gendered burden was male resistance to condoms, which is something I've written about in other places. Many men that I interviewed said they found condoms to be troublesome and uncomfortable. Some complained that the process of washing, storing, and reusing condoms, as depicted here, was simply unfeasible. Imagine you're living in very close proximity to your neighbors, your parents, your children, your coworkers, everyone seeing you hanging out your used condoms to dry. So I can sort of sympathize. But other men linked condoms to sex work, and they said that if there was no infidelity in the marriage, there would be no need for condoms. Other men refused to use condoms on the basis of reduced sensation and pleasure, an argument I'm sure you're familiar with. In fact, one 58-year-old man in Tianjin told me that he and his wife had long used the unreliable withdrawal method rather than condoms to preserve the feeling of flesh on flesh, even if it could have dire consequences. Still, other men mocked their wives relentlessly for bringing home condoms until they gave up the cause of promoting their use. Even when some work units began distributing condoms free of charge to employees in the 1970s, few couples would use them. Male resistance to condom use obviously is not unique to China, but in the Chinese context, it can be attributed in part to the widely held belief that contraception belongs in the female domain. My interviewees reported almost unanimously that men hated using condoms and would rather risk unwanted pregnancy than bother with this type of protection. So even though the government promoted family planning in the late 1950s, some Communist Party officials were still ambivalent about it. In fact, they argued that birth control was only needed to create greater spacing between births, something that would improve maternal and fetal health, rather than limiting population growth. In 1957, as part of the 100 Flowers movement, when Chairman Mao encouraged intellectuals to air their political grievances, reformers also called for greater access to birth control and demanded family planning for the sake of population limitation. However, those vocal intellectuals were silenced, and in 1958, the Communist Party launched the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to enact rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization that resulted in approximately 30 million deaths in 3 years, mostly due to man-made famine. This is particularly relevant because if we look at this chart of the birth rate from approximately the founding of the PRC to close to the present, we'll see that the only time that the death rate actually exceeded the birth rate was during the famine associated with the Great Leap Forward. So the population was more or less continually growing throughout this period. That is until 2022, when for the first time since the Great Leap Forward, the death rate actually was higher than the birth rate and the population actually shrank. So the Great Leap Forward, its failure made the need for family planning even more urgent. Officials taking up the call for birth planning sought to weave birth control into the local cultural fabric through posters and plays and exhibitions and focus groups. Authorities also encouraged late marriage or delaying marriage, when to shorten the time period in which individuals are able to reproduce, since the assumption is that reproduction and sex only takes place between married people. This movement also dovetailed with efforts to further mobilize women's labor. So we see, if you look at posters, birth planning posters from this period, they're often framing the benefits of birth control in terms of gender equality. For example, these images from the 60s and 70s are suggesting that if a young woman delays marriage, that'll give her the opportunity to work in industry or to work on her commune or to become an amateur scientist or to at least be able to work alongside men as equals. Yet resource shortages, contradictory messages from the state, and individual distrust or dislike of birth control, because of course this is an era when birth control is supposed to be voluntary, this continually undermined efforts to more systematically monitor and control reproduction. In 1966, Chairman Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, a political movement intended to destroy the ossifying bureaucratic class. Millions of Red Guards, these radicalized middle and high school age students, were encouraged to travel the country in co-ed bands, igniting class struggle. For these young people, many of whom had never left their hometowns before, this period offered a rare opportunity to travel and have unsupervised interaction with the opposite sex. Despite the social dislocation caused by this movement, birth planning propaganda actually increased steadily from the late 1960s onward. Here are some images. These are actually from the 70s, but you get the idea. Here we see birth planning propaganda that would have just been on the street or outside of a factory, and people are walking home from work or going about their daily business looking at these posters. This image is, I think, particularly interesting because it shows a women's health class, and it's notable the fact that everyone in the audience, or almost everyone, appears to be a woman. Why? Because of, I think it's because of this whole idea that birth control is a female responsibility. And because we know that unmarried couples were largely excluded from the conversation about family planning, we have to assume that these young women are newlyweds. So they're like the prime target for this kind of public health intervention. So in 1968, in part to curb the wanton violence of the Cultural Revolution, Mao accelerated the Sent Down Youth movement. This program that's meant to dispatch, or a program that dispatched 17 million urban youth to rural areas to, quote, learn from the peasants. Here we have some images of these youth in all of these remote places doing physical labor. During the movement, millions of youth were sent to the hinterland to serve on production brigades and in construction corps, as pictured here. What's less known is that this, or less well known, is that this period was characterized by high rates of illegal cohabitation, so couples living together without being married, premarital sex, rape, and abortion among sent down youth. By creating unprecedented opportunities for sex among unsupervised, unmarried youth with limited access to prophylactics, the state, I argued, paved the way for the contemporary reliance on abortion as a primary tool of family planning. The deployment of minimally trained barefoot doctors at this time helped integrate state-led family planning into the rural healthcare system. So we can see, once again, more women. Here we have these minimally trained kind of paramedics, and they're working with these happy young sent down youth. Again, they're showing them the benefits of family planning, and they're reminding them, hey, since you're newlyweds, you need to practice family planning. Yeah, local authorities at the same time were using the court system to arbitrarily police abortions. So in many cases, married urbanites were encouraged and later forced to engage in family planning, whereas unmarried rural residents were punished for practicing it. Here, my interviews shed further light on this situation. So two women that I interviewed in Tianjin, one in her 50s and one aged 75, argued that during the Cultural Revolution, there were lots of premarital relationships. But in most cases, rather than marrying the baby's father, if a girl became pregnant, she would throw away the child. Several interviewees affirmed the validity of this account, stating that countless sent down youth and Red Guards had premarital sex. According to one 57-year-old man from Shanghai, nobody wanted to raise a baby without a residence permit, or hukou, which was denied to children born out of wedlock. So the young mothers secretly would give birth to these babies in the countryside and then give them away to local families. State policies limiting movement created conditions that put women in a double bind. They could either keep their out-of-wedlock babies, who would then face life without the residence permit that they needed for everything, including housing, education, and medical care, or the mothers could give up or throw away their babies, all of which were emotionally traumatic courses of action. In other cases, unmarried women might try to drown their babies, or they would have dangerous, sometimes fatal abortions administered by amateur practitioners or local doctors. According to two former sent down youths from Tianjin, getting pregnant out of wedlock and keeping the baby was actually more shameful at that time than having an abortion. So unmarried young women during the Cultural Revolution underwent abortions to avoid losing face. Relationships between sent down youth or sent down youth and locals, because of course the sent down youth are privileged people typically from the city. These relationships that resulted in forbidden pregnancies seem to have been common, but the consequences varied significantly. A series of typically inaccessible court records from rural Jiangxi suggests that the outcome of sexual relationships, regardless of consent, and the resultant pregnancies were closely linked to the status of the couple involved. The case of Cheng Xuan, a man who came from a peasant family that farmed a small plot of rented land in rural Jiangxi, is illustrative. Although Cheng only had a junior high school education, he first served as a village clerk, then as a socialist educator for his work team, and eventually as a junior high school teacher. At age 40, he met Fang Lingling, a sent-down youth, a teenager from Shanghai, and the two began sleeping together, and Fang became pregnant. Chung asked other people to help him procure an abortifacient, but the abortion was unsuccessful. When news of the affair got out, Chung, although he had been dismissed from his job, stole a letter of introduction from his work unit and brought Fang to a hotel where the couple were able to share a room by posing as husband and wife. Finally, Chung took Fang to the commune health clinic, where he found a doctor who was actually willing to perform the abortion. In this case, Chung's position provided him with the resources to escape some level of scrutiny in the commune and attain an abortion for Fang. In another case, a sent-down youth from Shanghai developed a relationship with the local party secretary, a college-educated man from Shanghai who was 20 years her senior. When the young woman discovered that she was pregnant, the couple was pretty desperate and they experimented with all sorts of things, including baiyao, musk, and other Chinese herbal abortifacients to no avail. Finally, the young woman was able to use her urban residence permit to return home to Shanghai, where she had a surgical abortion. Around the same time, a female sent-down youth called Cao, also from Shanghai, developed a relationship with the head of her work unit. The couple met secretly many times, and when Cao discovered she was pregnant, she consumed shui, or 10 drops, which is a Chinese patent medicine used to cool the body. What's interesting about 10 drops is that in traditional Chinese medicine, heat is associated with pregnancy. So the idea is that if you take a medicine that cools the body, this could actually terminate the pregnancy. When the medication failed to induce an abortion, though, and Cao's pregnancy was discovered, her work unit actually permitted her to have a surgical abortion to, quote, prevent the spread of her negative influence to her peers. In all of these cases, the young women were permitted to have abortions either at a commune clinic in the countryside or at an urban hospital. In general, though, young women without these connections to the city, especially women with rural hukou and those who developed relationships with less prominent figures in their communes, did not fare as well, if you could say they fared well as the young women in the previous cases. The fates of these women were closely linked to the statuses of the men they were involved with. So men with seniority, access to greater resources, and higher levels of education could offer their lovers more flexibility in terms of access to abortions. At the same time, it's plausible that men in senior positions, nearly all of whom were married, had greater incentive to help their partners attain abortions because they had reputations and careers to protect. So moving forward, in the early 1970s, while the sent-down youth movement that I was just discussing was just getting underway, the state began taking more radical steps to limit population growth. These policies can be attributed in part to the global so-called population establishment. And this is the transnational network of scholars, activists, and politicians who are perpetuating this neo-Malthusian idea that the world is overpopulated and heading toward a demographic crisis. The neo-Malthusians were reviving the ideas of Thomas Malthus from the late 18th century, but neo-Malthusians actually said that birth control needed to be used to avert a population crisis, and they were particularly preoccupied with birth control use in non-Western countries and communities of color and among the world's poor. At this time, the dominant line of thinking, demographic transition theory, contended that decreased fertility levels resulted from aggressive birth control activism could actually foster rapid economic modernization within these developing societies. So in conjunction with anti-communist policies, demographic transition theory led to widespread efforts to reduce fertility in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In line with the view that population control was essential for economic development, the Chinese state first encouraged families to have just 3 children under the policy later, longer, fewer. So wait later to have children, wait longer between children, and have fewer kids altogether. Then they moved to a new slogan, one is best, two at most. So that's pretty self-evident, self-explanatory. And then finally, the infamous one-child policy in 1979. And we can see from the kind of imagery from the early 1980s what the messaging is. Clearly, birth planning is going to inaugurate China's technological modernity and allow for this kind of newfangled technology and high rises and things like flying children. And it's also going to allow for very ruddy faced and chubby little babies that are going to go on and build a strong nation. A system of punishments and rewards was used to enforce the policy, as is probably well known, with one-child families being given privileged access to education and housing, while punishments for violating the policy ranged from fines to mandatory abortion or sterilization, or even other things. In 1984, though, restrictions were actually relaxed in some places in response to widespread rural resistance to the policy. After that, only about 1/3 of the population continued to fall under the original policy, and yet the name one-child policy has endured. So I want to return to my opening question of how abortion became normalized. Sex-selective abortions and abortions as punishments for violating the one-child policy are relatively well known. What is less well known is other circumstances surrounding abortions. So in the early 2000s, a medical ethicist interviewed hundreds of Chinese women about their experiences with abortion. And he found that the two most common reasons for undergoing this procedure were being forced to adhere to the national family planning policy and premarital sex, which I'll talk about in a minute. Statistically, abortions increased steadily in the late 1970s and early 1980s and remained at over 42% of live births through 1995. For comparison, the US has an annual abortion rate of approximately 13 to 14%. Abortion rates also spiked first in 1983 to 70% and again in 1991 to 62%, each time in response to the availability of the previous year's census figures. Shanghai had far and away the most abortions throughout the 1990s, with particularly high rates among unmarried teenage girls. Indeed, in 1994, Shanghai had an astonishing 287 abortions per 100 live births. So what is perhaps less well known about abortion under the one-child policy is that abortions were often used in the case of failed contraceptives that resulted in pregnancy rather than simply as a punishment for policy violators. According to official data, in 1982, 48% of abortions were due to contraceptive failure. And by 1990, this number had reached 70% and was largely due to ineffective IUDs. Negative perceptions of premarital sex and lack of sex education are also two issues closely linked to abortion rates that have roots in the Mao and Republican eras. In the 1980s, as today, often women were ashamed that they had engaged in premarital sex or had become pregnant out of wedlock, conduct that was still, even in the 80s, considered immoral and taboo. Furthermore, they feared legal repercussions as premarital sex was still technically classified as hooliganism, so it was punishable by law. Therefore, young women sought to secretly remedy their situations and avoid having unauthorized children. In some cases, abortion seekers were young women who had engaged in intercourse with their fiancés but could not get formal permission to marry due to age or work restrictions. Since the 1980s, rates of premarital sex have risen dramatically from 15% to more than 70%, further exacerbating the reliance on abortion as birth control. Limited sex education has further compounded the issues caused by negative attitudes toward premarital sex. As I've written elsewhere, no more than 57% of Chinese high school and college students are estimated to have been exposed to some form of sex education. And although sex education tends to be more common in urban areas rather than rural ones, a recent survey by the Shanghai municipal government showed that even in a city like Shanghai, only 15% of high school students had received some form of sex education from either teachers or parents. While official statistics estimate that over 13 million abortions are performed annually, 62% among women ages 20 to 29. Experts argue that this is a vast underestimation because it overlooks non-surgical abortions, which is the primary form of abortion today, as well as those carried out in unlicensed clinics. According to the chief physician of the gynecology and obstetrics department at a hospital in Tianjin, the number of girls under 16 undergoing abortions at her hospital is increasing by 30% annually. The founder of an internet-based sex education company notably stated that many women, quote, think having an abortion is like taking a nap because advertisements quote, claim to offer painless abortions. Therefore, young women underestimate the seriousness of these procedures. Here are some images from advertisements on the street for these so-called painless abortions that allegedly are safe, they will not expand your uterus, and you won't feel a thing, all for a mere $15 to $16. So to conclude, in 2016, in response to the steeply declining birth rate, the one-child policy was formally replaced with the two-child policy. Then in 2021, the policy was again relaxed, but with more than 18% of the population over 60, the central government is now encouraging larger families to support the country's graying population and supplement the dwindling workforce. So far, efforts to encourage women to have more children have not borne much fruit. The high cost of raising and educating a child, educated women's emphasis on independence and career advancement in school, and recent memories of the one-child policy's brutal enforcement have made producing larger families less desirable. Hence, the State Council's suggestion in 2021 that abortions be limited to those that are, quote, medically necessary, a move that actually builds on abortion restrictions recently introduced at the provincial level. One might argue that limiting access to abortions might encourage the use of prophylactics, but one only needs to look at the Republican and Mao eras to see that limiting access to abortion only drives the abortion market underground. Of course, there are countless other examples of similar scenarios across the world and in different historical eras. So in sum, reproduction has long played a central role in Chinese politics and nation building, but population policies have varied dramatically over time. Between 1911 and 1949, the nationalists supported a policy of controlled natalism, wherein abortions and sterilizations were legally restricted, and yet they were widely common. Women facing poverty, job loss, or social pressure to conceal extramarital or premarital sex resorted to abortions. Once the communists came to power, they banned or severely limited access to contraceptives and abortions. However, grain shortages and labor inefficiency led to the relaxation of these restrictions, which ultimately paved the way for aggressive population control from the late 1970s onward. All the while, though, the timeline, intensity, and even the methods of policy enforcement remained inconsistent. An examination of local politics, logistics, and individual circumstances reveals a great diversity of experiences with reproduction and contraception, and shows that the state, despite what we see in the media, was hardly omnipotent or monolithic. As to abortion, inconsistent state policies, patriarchal norms, and limited sex education have historically worked in concert to normalize abortion as birth control. In the long term, the obsession with engineering the population has enabled greater and greater state interference into private life and a focus on the intimate details of women's bodies. Unfortunately, these recent efforts to promote population growth and limit access to abortions also suggest that women's interests will continue to be subordinated to those of the state. I want to conclude with some images of me conducting my oral histories. This is one of my favorite images of a 83-year-old woman who, this was 2016, and she dyed her hair blonde in solidarity with Donald Trump. I'm going to conclude with some recommended readings, and I look forward to receiving your questions in the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for listening.